All right, so let's dive into the headlines today. We've got a lot to cover, kind of a whirlwind tour of what's happening around the world. It's everything from health to, well, international relations, security concerns, oh, and even some big business news. A lot going on.
It really does feel like we're looking at a world in constant motion, doesn't it?
It does. And speaking of a world in motion, let's start with this report from the WHO. 7 million people a year
7 million.
dying because of air pollution.
It's a staggering figure, isn't it? And it really hits home when you consider that the WHO also found that 99% of the global population is breathing air that exceeds their guidelines.
Basically, almost everyone on the planet is breathing air that's not good for them. And it's not just those obvious, heavily industrialized areas, right? This report makes it clear that this is a global issue.
Right. The WHO actually highlights that it's the low and middle income countries that are bearing the brunt of this. They're the ones facing the highest levels of pollutants.
And we're talking about everything from particulate matter to carbon monoxide, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide. It's a long list.
It is. And the sources are just as varied, too. Think about it. You've got household combustion, people using kerosene or burning biomass for cooking and heating.
Right, everyday stuff. And then, of course, you've got the big contributors like vehicles and industry, and even forest fires play a role.
It all adds up. And the consequences, well, they go far beyond just breathing problems.
That's right. The WHO report actually connects prolonged exposure to air pollution with an increased risk of mental health issues. Depression, anxiety, even dementia.
It's a connection that many people don't immediately make, but it's crucial to understand the full scope of the impact. And it doesn't stop there. This air pollution also affects food security.
Exactly. It can damage crops, slow down their growth, and even make them less nutritious. So it's not just a health issue, it's a food issue, it's an economic issue. It's complex.
Absolutely. Solving a problem this big requires a multi-pronged approach, doesn't it? We're talking about environmental regulations, public health initiatives, sustainable development practices, a lot to consider.
Definitely. All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what's happening between Algeria and France. Algeria has announced a ban on French aid to their private schools. This is a big deal because for decades, France has been funding these schools essentially to promote their language and culture there.
And this move comes against a backdrop of, well, let's say rising tensions between the two countries. It's not happening in isolation. To put this into perspective, remember in 2022, France gave Algeria $132 million in development assistance. And just this February, they set aside another $121 million for Algerian students to study in France. So this ban is a pretty significant policy shift.
And it's not entirely out of the blue either. Algeria has already been making moves in this direction, right? They suspended the French curriculum in those private schools back in October of 2023, and now they're actively introducing English into their primary education system.
Right. Part of this is definitely a response to some voices within France itself calling for reduction in aid. There are also some disagreements between the two countries on certain issues like Western Sahara that are definitely playing a role.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how these historical ties between former colonial powers and their colonies are evolving, isn't it? It looks like Algeria might be seeking a bit more autonomy, maybe a recalibration of its international partnerships.
It's a trend we're seeing in other parts of the world as well. And the tensions between France and Algeria are pretty evident in other areas too. Just last November, Algeria instructed its banks to stop doing business with French companies.
And they've also refused to take back Algerian migrants from France who don't have the right papers. All these things together paint a picture of a relationship that's becoming increasingly strained.
It'll be interesting to see where this goes, what it means for the future of Franco-Algerian relations, and what impact it will have on their economic and cultural ties.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move over to Nigeria now. The EFCC, that's the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, just busted a pretty big operation. They're calling it a Ponzi scheme academy, operating right in Abuja. 133 suspects were arrested.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And the Nigerian army was involved in this operation as well. It looks like this academy, they call themselves Q University or QNet, was luring in young Nigerians with promises of, well, let's just say outlandish profits.
You're being kind. They actually had a program called, get this, Special Training for a New Generation Billionaire. I mean, come on.
Right. It's almost comical. But these schemes prey on people's hopes, their dreams of a better life. It's actually pretty sad.
It is. The EFCC said recruits were required to buy an independent representative application form, which even had slogans on it like, "I'm a champion."
Wow.
Yeah. During the raid, authorities seized a bunch of phones and computers, which will probably be key in figuring out how this whole thing worked and who was pulling the strings.
Absolutely. This is a good reminder for everyone, though. These schemes might seem legitimate at first glance, but they're built on a house of cards. They're not sustainable, and people end up losing a lot of money.
For sure. Always be wary of anything that promises huge returns with little to no risk. All right, some more news out of Nigeria, unfortunately. This time it's about security. Suspected Boko Haram, or ISWAP terrorists, attacked a Nigerian military forward operating base, an FOB, in Borno State.
This happened late on Monday night in Wajiroko. It's a very serious situation. At least 3 soldiers were killed.
And to make matters worse, the brigade commander and 2 other soldiers were hurt by an IED while they were on their way to help defend the base.
It really highlights the dangers these soldiers face every day. And the fact that they were hit with an IED suggests that this was a planned and coordinated attack.
A surveillance drone spotted fire at the base and even saw troops retreating, which is raising concerns that the base might have been overrun. Reinforcements are being sent in, and troops in the area are on high alert. It's a very tense situation.
This really underscores the ongoing security challenges that Nigeria is facing, particularly in the northeast. And it reminds us of the sacrifices these soldiers are making to fight these extremist groups.
Absolutely. Now, shifting to the US, there's been a rather disturbing incident in Austin, Texas. Multiple incendiary devices were found at a Tesla showroom. They were discovered early Monday morning after someone tipped off the authorities.
And this isn't an isolated incident. There's been a whole string of attacks targeting Tesla locations across the US in at least 9 different states.
Wow. Because of the scale of this, the FBI and the ATF have teamed up to form a joint task force to handle the investigation. It's clearly a serious matter.
It definitely seems that way.
And here's where things get a little bit, well, politically charged. These attacks are happening at the same time that Tesla's CEO, Elon Musk, is serving in President Trump's administration. He's heading up the Department of Government Efficiency, which some people call DOGE. And there's some speculation that these attacks might be connected to some backlash against cost-cutting measures and layoffs, either at Tesla or more broadly within the administration.
It's important to remember that at this point, those are just theories. The investigation is ongoing, and we don't know the motives behind these attacks for sure. However, the authorities are not taking this lightly.
Right. Attorney General Pamela Bondi has already made it clear that anyone caught doing this could face some serious consequences, like 5 to 20 years behind bars. President Trump himself has also condemned these attacks, calling them acts of domestic terrorism.
It'll be interesting to see what the investigation uncovers.
Okay, back to Nigeria now. There's a legal battle brewing in Oyo State, and the state government is planning to challenge the establishment of a Sharia panel in Oyo Town. They're arguing that only the state or federal government has the power to create judicial bodies, and they're prepared to take this to court.
Governor McKinley's administration is pretty clear on this. Their position is that any group that wants to make legal judgments has to have the state's backing to operate legally within the state. They see this as a constitutional issue.
But here's the thing, the Sharia Committee of Oyo Land is saying that their panel is already up and running. They meet every Thursday to deal with things like marital disputes, inheritance cases, and land conflicts.
Really?
Yeah. They're saying that Nigerian law allows for the use of Sharia law in civil cases as long as those involved agree to it. And they're even claiming that similar panels exist in other parts of Oyo State.
This is definitely going to be an interesting case to follow. It raises some complicated questions about how religious legal traditions and the secular legal system in Nigeria interact.
The Christian Association of Nigeria in Oyo State has also expressed surprise at this development and has said they'll be looking into it further. It seems like this could have some pretty big implications for the relationship between state law and religious practices in Nigeria.
Definitely. Okay, switching gears now, let's talk about some big news in the tech world. Samsung Electronics co-CEO Han Jong-hee has died of a heart attack.
It's a big loss for Samsung, especially since they're facing some tough competition in the semiconductor and smartphone markets right now. Jun Young Han, who was only recently appointed as co-CEO, is now the sole leader of the company.
It's definitely a challenging time for him to take the helm.
Samsung's shares actually dipped a little after the news broke. Han had been with Samsung for nearly 40 years and was a key figure in their TV business. He'd even said publicly that 2025 was going to be a rough year because of the new U.S. tariffs under President Trump.
It'll be interesting to see how Samsung navigates the global trade landscape going forward. And speaking of global trade, Samsung chairman J.Y. Lee is currently in China, visiting some major players like Xiaomi and BYD.
Oh, that's right. Seems like they might be looking at some future partnerships, maybe some new strategic directions.
Could be. It's a dynamic industry, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, second to last headline. President Trump has announced that a deal with Ukraine for strategic raw materials is almost done. His Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is saying it's basically a done deal and just needs to be signed.
And President Trump has emphasized that the U.S. remains the main source of aid for Ukraine. This deal actually goes back to February, when Ukrainian President Zelensky came to Washington specifically to sign it. But for whatever reason, it didn't happen then.
There have been some reports that maybe there were some disagreements, and it's worth noting that President Trump has very clearly linked U.S. aid to Ukraine with access to their raw materials, especially rare earth elements, which are super important for a lot of high-tech industries.
Right, and of course the situation's even more complex because many of those resources are in areas of Ukraine that are currently controlled by Russia.
It's a messy situation, to say the least.
Very much so. All right, our last headline takes us back to Ukraine, but with some very bad news this time. A Russian missile strike on the city of Sumy has injured 88 people, including 17 children.
This is just awful. The attack also damaged a school and a hospital.
Places that should never be targets. And what makes it even worse is that it happened while Russian and U.S. officials were meeting in Saudi Arabia, supposedly to talk about a ceasefire.
Ukraine has condemned the attack, basically calling Russia's talk about peace meaningless in light of these actions. It definitely casts a shadow over those talks.
No doubt. The discussions in Saudi Arabia apparently covered things like the safety of energy infrastructure and shipping in the Black Sea.
Which have both been majorly affected by the conflict, of course.
Absolutely. There were even reports that they talked about potential territorial lines, and President Trump reportedly even brought up the possibility of the U.S. taking ownership of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
Wow, that's a big one.
It is. And to add to all this, Ukraine's intelligence agency, the SBU, has accused Russia of recruiting Ukrainian teenagers to carry out terrorist attacks.
Oh, wow, that's a serious accusation. It's just a deeply troubling situation all around. Well, folks, those are the top news headlines for today, March 25th. It's been a bit of a roller coaster, hasn't it?
It has. We've covered everything from a global health crisis to political tensions, security threats, even some big developments in the business world. It really shows you how interconnected everything is.
It does. Thanks for joining us for this whirlwind tour of current events.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the today's top news headlines on IAMC Radio and Podcast.